Two attacks in 2 months, both by men convicted on terror charges. Now Britain wants to introduce a new law ending the early release of those prisoners. But will it make the country any safer? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the UK's emergency terror law. Sudesh Aman had been a free man for just 10 days when he stole a knife and went on a stabbing spree in London. It was the second such attack in recent months, and it had many people asking the question why those convicted on terror charges were not only being released, but being released early. In the wake of last week's attack, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said those found guilty of terror offences must serve their full sentences. Now his government is planning to introduce emergency terror laws that could implement something similar. But the new legislation is facing resistance. Critics say the proposed bill may not even be legal. And even if it does pass Parliament, would it actually prevent future terror attacks? We'll debate that shortly. But first, Francis Collins has this report.
It's becoming a familiar scene in the UK. Cordoned off streets, police barriers, and palpable fear after another terror attack. Most recently in Streatham, South London, just over a week ago. A knife attack by a released prisoner, Sudesh Aman. He was shot dead by police after he went on a rampage with a stolen 10-inch knife. He'd been out of jail for just 10 days, released halfway through a jail sentence for 13 terror-related offences.
What was he doing out on automatic early release, and why was there no system of scrutiny, no parole system to check whether he was really a suitable candidate for automatic early release? And that is a very complex legal question.
Why is it? Move away! Keep going! Out of the way, please! Out of the way!
There were similar sentiments after the previous attack on London Bridge in November. Another prisoner released on licence, Usman Khan, stabbed 5 people and killed 2 before being shot and killed himself by police. Now the British government is introducing emergency legislation.
Will the crackdown on terror laws work?
It wants to ban those convicted of terror offences from being automatically released halfway through their prison terms. And it could be law by the end of the month. But it may not stop there. There is concern that Britain could temporarily remove itself from the European Convention on Human Rights to push through these laws. It's a separate body from the European Union, and Britain remains a member. But it could be the first major test of Britain's relationship with Europe's legal institutions following Brexit. And it's been criticised by the opposition in the UK, as well as human rights groups. Shadow Attorney General Shami Chakrabarti said it was a ploy to give Tory party members anti-European red meat. Or can it be seen as part of a British government response to the apparent changing nature of terrorist attacks? Large-scale attacks are diminishing, and there seems to be more lone wolf scenarios like London Bridge or Streatham that are harder to predict and prevent. Francis Collins, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our guest in London. Ajmal Masroor is an imam and a member of the Muslim Council of Britain. He's also the chairman and director of the non-profit Communities in Action. Charles Shoebridge is a security analyst and former UK counter-terrorism officer. And Ben Harris-Quinney is chairman of the conservative think tank, the Bow Group. Gentlemen, good to have you all on the program. Ben, let's start with you. This emergency legislation, do you believe it's necessary?
Yes, I don't think it's necessary to play catch up with cases that are coming up like that of Mohammed Khan and his early release. I don't think the government should ever be making legislation on the basis of press coverage. But I think there has been a feeling that over the past years, with people like David Gauke as Justice Secretary, there has been a liberalisation of criminal justice policy that there wasn't the support for in the Conservative Party and there wasn't the support for in the country. And I think Priti Patel wants to be a strong Home Secretary, wants to be a Home Secretary that leads on justice. And I think the principle with Priti Patel is that justice is there for the benefit of the victims of crime, not the perpetrators of crime. And so on this issue, on terror, that is kind of the most pressing, where these sentences will be changed and the sentencing process will be changed. But I think it also applies to a number of other crimes also in terms of early release.
Okay, so Ajmal Masroor, after London Bridge, after Streatham, something needs to be done. And at the very least, the bare minimum, you take the concept of releasing them at the halfway mark and you push it to the 2/3 mark. Do you oppose that?
It should never be arbitrarily release of any individual or automatic release. I think everybody would agree that anyone who is in the prison and serving a sentence need to be evaluated by experts. Their mental state, their physical state, every state that will keep our country safe would need to be assessed. So I don't want to go down that route of saying whether it is or it isn't acceptable. However, it is important to note that individuals in our country, we all have rights. We are signatory to human rights, etc. So we need to keep that in mind. But the biggest failure of this government and for successive governments have been that they have not listened to the voices of those people who have been saying prevent agenda hasn't worked. Billions of dollars, trillions of dollars from America and billions from UK have been spent on de-radicalizing young people. It hasn't worked. This government has cut prison funding. This government has cut youth funding. This government has cut everything. And then it expects that there will be no reaction and there will be no consequence. And I think the problem we have is that for as long as we do not address the elephant in the room, and that is that prevent agenda hasn't worked, and those right-wing lobbyists who have been making lots of money by claiming to be experts on counter-terrorism have in fact miserably failed, unless we address those issues, I can tell you with all my conviction that if you change the legislation, nothing will change.
But Ajmal, we have Ben saying that there's been a liberalization here, that the system, the justice system is being too soft on those convicted on terror offences, and you're saying the prevent agenda is some sort of big right-wing conspiracy.
And I'm saying exactly that. I think while we have a terribly failing justice system in many fronts in our country, that needs to be addressed separately. And if the legal review finds that our punitive measure against these terrorists are too soft, then that's what the law would do. However, it's a comprehensive process, it's a comprehensive approach. If the government has failed in keeping our country safe, if the government has spent millions of my money and your money in wasted in programs that will only tick the right-wing boxes, then I think that we need to address that and say shut down prevent immediately, stop engaging those so-called experts, lobbyists who are making money out of prevent, and speak to authentic voices of people who have successfully persuaded their communities to work together and give them voices of hope, voices of a good future, and positive role model rather than criminalizing individuals before they've even done it.
And we're going to circle back to that in a moment, but with Usman Khan, it had seemed as if he had passed all those tests of being de-radicalized, only then to just stab two people to death, those that were working closely with him. Charles Shoebridge, are we in a position where actually both the other two gentlemen are right?
Yes, there are certainly elements that are true, I think, in both. And I'm speaking, of course, from a practitioner perspective, certainly a past practitioner here. And so therefore, of course, I'm interested naturally issues such as rights and justice, and that includes justice for victims and also potential victims is important, as well as justice for the perpetrators and alleged perpetrators too. But really, I think what we're interested in, or should be interested in at this stage, is what will work. Your previous speaker is right, I think, in respect of the de-radicalization programs. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's some kind of right-wing conspiracy, but it certainly has become a very lucrative industry. I always call it the de-radicalization industry when I refer to it, and largely, unfortunately, a lot of the success, shall we say, of that program is measured by the very people who stand to gain from being awarded more so-called de-radicalization contracts. But when we're talking about the specifics here of the prison regime in terms of the length of sentences and so on, again, we need to ask, will these proposed changes work? And whilst it's naturally people want people to actually serve the sentence that they're given, and not just in terrorism, in many other offences as well, it's true that, for example, in this Streatham case, had he served 2/3 instead of a half of his sentence, or even the full sentence, he would have again been released within a few months. He was only serving a sentence, remember, of 3 years for the terrorist offences itself. And so it's not a question of just lengthening the sentence, because you still have the problem that they're going to be released at some stage.
Right, and that's an interesting point. And when we look at the details of Sudesh Amman, he went to jail for circulating terror-supporting material, terrorist propaganda. That's very different to Usman Khan, who actually planned to blow up the stock exchange. So I guess, you know, every circumstance is different here with each individual. Ben, address this part for me. The fact that the longer that you're in prison for, the more likely it is that you'll become more and more radical. Prison does not de-radicalize you. It does not rehabilitate you. It only makes you worse.
Well, I think our current prison system has a huge number of problems, and it is because of underinvestment. I think if you want to be tough on crime, as the Conservative Party has signalled that it does want to be over the last decade, you have to be willing to pay for those prison places and make prison a tough place to be. I mean, our prisons at the moment are swimming with drugs, which I think is testament to the fact that these are not secure facilities, and they're not facilities in which people are truly being punished for their crimes. So it's right to say the government has a decision to make if they want to seriously punish criminals. And 99% of this is not about rehabilitating criminals. It's not about helping criminals. It's about punishing criminals. And your other speaker talked about listening to the public. Well, I think you'll find that if you listen to the public on the issue of what kind of sentences and what kind of treatment terrorists should receive, they'll be a lot harsher than that which the government is currently putting forward. So I would absolutely encourage the government to listen to the public and to send terrorists away for the entirety of their lives. But you need to have the facility in order to incarcerate those people for the entirety of their lives. That's what I would do. There would be no question of rehabilitation. There would be no question of release if you are a terrorist. That will be the end of your engagement with British society. That would be the policy that I would advocate.
Okay, gentlemen, stay where you are. I'm going to speak now to Kartik Raj, who's a counter-terrorism researcher at Human Rights Watch. Kartik Raj, thanks for joining us here on the Newsmakers. I wonder, can the UK do this without compromising human rights?
I'm afraid I haven't been on the call to this point. So when you say do this, what precisely do you mean?
Okay. I know you've just dialed in very recently. Can it actually enact these emergency laws without compromising human rights?
Well, what we've seen so far is a proposal that a law might be put forward, right, in the Queen's speech and in the speech that the Justice Minister made last week. And we're yet to see the concrete proposals that the government will put forward as draft legislation. So it's a little bit hard to comment. But if the question is, will the UK be able to retrospectively change the sentences that currently convicted terrorism offenders who are serving time in jails, the answer probably is no, because that would run against the principles of law generally and human rights law in particular.
And when they point to the fact that the UK had derogated from Article 5 of the ECHR, the right to liberty and security during the Troubles, right, in Northern Ireland, and so leaving the ECHR and leaving some of these partnerships, I mean, Britain's already left the European Union, but leaving some of these additional partnerships on issues such as human rights and the law, well, you know what? Sometimes you have to bend it a little bit. Your response is what?
Sure. I mean, this, again, I don't know to what extent your viewers want to know the intricacies of human rights law, but the basics are pretty simple. With the European Convention on Human Rights, in a time of national emergency under prescribed circumstances for a limited amount of time, any member state of the European Convention can write to the Council of Europe and say, we'd like to withdraw for this period for this reason. There are certain rights, though, that they can never say we are going to ignore or suspend. The right to be free from torture, the right not to face the death penalty, and the right not to be prosecuted for a crime that didn't exist in the law books when you were prosecuted. And this is one of those.
We're seeing a trend that is beyond the borders of the UK. The French are also coming under pressure from their electorate and others within the government to also address this issue of early release of those convicted on terror offences. And again, it could be from people who actually might have engaged in physical terrorism or those who might have supported terrorism and ended up in jail. What does that tell us about where things are going?
Sure. I think the main point is that the main thing it indicates is that the counter-radicalization programs that exist in prisons in the UK and in some other countries are not working to the extent that states want them to. And that's something that will require a significant amount of investment, and as will the services, the police services that monitor people once they're released from prison. But if you talk about whether or not people should be released at a certain point in their prison sentence, those sorts of rules already exist in the UK. For instance, the Counter-terrorism Act 2008, right, 2008, we're talking 12 years ago, specifies certain kinds of terrorism offences where people are not eligible for early release or automatic release at the time that other sorts of offenders are. That sort of latitude exists for states like the United Kingdom, like France, to implement. And that doesn't involve somehow like creating an outlandish idea that they're going to throw out all adherence to the European Convention, or put forward talk of derogation on a right that no country that signs the European Convention can derogate from. And instead talk more modestly about investing in counter-radicalization, investing in rehabilitation, investing in the resources required to track released offenders, in the probation services. And those are tough calls. It's much easier to say as a government, we're going to create a new law that's going to be super tough, without addressing the laws, policies, and police apparatus they have at their disposal, that some of which have not been invested in.
Okay. Kartik, good to talk to you. Good to get the perspective from
Thanks
Human
very
Rights
much.
Watch. Pleasure having you on the
Thank you.
Newsmakers. Let's go back now to our guests in London, Ajmal Masroor, Charles Shoebridge, and Ben Harris-Quinney. Ben, Kartik's saying you don't actually have to reinvent the wheel because there is the latitude within the existing framework to do this properly. It's just not being done well enough. He has a point, doesn't he?
Well, he has a point about the existing framework. The ECHR framework is in place. I don't think it will be in place for much longer. I think you can expect Britain to leave the ECHR, and we will set our own human rights laws going forward. That's certainly the intent of the Home Secretary. So, when people talk about will it still comply with human rights, human rights is not a universally defined thing. But I think you will find, and I certainly hope, that Britain will continue to have a robust approach to human rights and will value the sanctity and the liberty of each free citizen, law-abiding citizen. But I don't think this superstructure imposed from a European level, although not part of the EU, allied to the EU, will continue to have effect in the United Kingdom into the future. And as I say, I think the views of the public would dictate a much tougher approach to terrorism going forward.
I mean, that's an interesting one. I mean, I don't know what the views of the public are per se, but I do know what the views of Matt Hancock. I know Matt Hancock's views on this, and this is pretty strong, the Health and Social Care Secretary. Charles Shoebridge, when there was pushback from the Europeans, Matt Hancock said, what about our human rights? What about the human rights of people to be able to walk freely around the streets of London? So it's as if you have this choice. It's the human rights of the people or the human rights of the terrorists. Is that a false choice being presented?
Yes, it is a false choice. It's a political slogan that's used there. It's a Daily Mail type headline here, a tabloid that provokes fear and also points blame in one direction. It's absolutely clear that the European Convention on Human Rights has almost nothing whatsoever to do with the EU, and it was used as a Brexit argument. In fact, if you speak to people about the Human Rights Act, which is the passage of the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law, if you spoke to people, I mean, for example, my mum, for example, used to say, these terrorists get all these rights. And I'd say, so, for example, the right not to be tortured by the state or the right not to be summarily executed by the state. you disagree with that. And of course she'd say, well, of course not. But of course the Daily Mail hadn't mentioned that. And so it's an easy target to make. But the point is this, that you've got a Conservative government, if we want to be political about this, that has been in power for some 10 years. It constantly talks about being tough on terrorism and tough on crime, but it actually isn't. It isn't any more tough than previous governments. And the toughest government, in fact, to speak as a practitioner, we've had for some time on terrorism and on crime generally, for all his other faults, was that of Tony Blair, a Labour government. And so really we need to take this, I think, out of the political orbit and talk about what actually works here. You've got to remember that a lot of terrorists are in prison for terrorism offences which aren't related to actually violence. A lot of the terrorists that are in prison are not Islamist terrorists, for example. They are environmental activists, they are far right and so on. So it encompasses a wide range of different people. A lot of the people are very, very young. But above all, I think the public needs protection. That's the main reason we should have people in prison. And what we should really have is a system where people are not released, whatever their sentence is, before some kind of assessment takes place. And if necessary, there should be, and I agree with this proposal, although it's not specifically part of what's been proposed at the moment, the indeterminate sentences where there is no end to that sentence until an expert panel has decided it's safe to release someone should be reconsidered. Because as I said earlier, whether someone serves 2/3 or half or their full sentence, they're going to be released at some point under the system even that's proposed. And if someone is still dangerous even at the end of their sentence, surely the public deserves protection from that person. Of course, there should be guarantees that that can be appealed and so on. But there is this balance that can be struck between public protection and the rights of the individual. And that can certainly be achieved, I think, within the European Convention of Human Rights. Other states do it, and so should Britain.
Ajmal, we have Charles saying that we need to pull this out of the political orbit, but the reality is it's very much in the political orbit. And given the context of this government, I wonder when we have something like Shamima Begum having her citizenship removed, do you consider it all a part of the same basket of political issues?
I think the government is ignoring the experts, not just experts on counter-terrorism, but also community experts, the faith leaders, those of us who deal with people every day. I'll give you a good example. I went to a prison a little while back. In that prison, I met a very ardent, very hardened extremist who has been convicted for his extremism activities outside. While I was there, I delivered a number of lectures. It wasn't part of Prevent, it was just an ordinary program. He wrote to me extensive letters, apologizing, showing that he's reformed, he's become better. And eventually, at some stage, he was released. But as soon as he was released, he sent me a threatening letter, the same guy. There is a problem. The problem is, those who go to prison for these kind of offences, if you throw the key away and lock them up permanently, there is a cost. The cost is on the taxpayers, number one. And number two, when they associate themselves with any other prison or encounter them, they also have the potential to de-radicalize them. My proposal is very simple. De-radicalization program should not be led by toxic people, divisive people, or people who have no credibility in the eyes of the community. It should be led by people who are experts, but they have also have personal credibility and credibility across the community. That's number one. Number two, I just want to make a point, and I think it's a bed bug for me and has been for a long time. All the experts, whenever they talk about de-radicalization or even extremism, they have to use the word Islamic, Islamist, and Islamism. We don't use the same for Christianity or Judaism or any other. Let's not use that terminology, because the moment you say Islam, with the behavior of these nutters, you glorify them, you give them credence, you give them some sort of a credit. They don't need it. Don't deride Islam at the back of their idiotic behavior. And the third and the final one, Tony Blair was right when he said this, though I disagree with many of his policies. We should be tough on crime, and we should also be tough on the causes of crime. This government and many of the governments have been dealing with the crime itself and not causes of crime. So I would take a comprehensive approach. I would look at reviewing the law, of course, but I would look at a completely different program for these individuals, and I would talk about how to rehabilitate them even when they're ready. But there is no shortcut to it.
Okay, Ben, very finally, we've got a minute left on the program. Briefly, please. Ajmal has a different approach. Are you partial to any of it?
I think he's right to say that it's not only people that define themselves as being Muslims that commit terrorism, but I think where the country is and where the Conservative Party is and where the government is to get a lot tougher on sentencing. And I think that's a good thing. I think what your other speakers have said is absolutely right, that the Conservative Party has been in power for 10 years and they haven't been tough on crime. Well, now they've got a majority, and now they need to put their money where their mouth is and get tough on crime. And I would be a lot tougher with terrorists, but I think they're moving at least in the right direction. And again, it must be, the focus must be on putting the victims of crime first, not the perpetrators of crime. If terrorists go to prison for the rest of their lives and never get out again, I don't think anyone would have a problem with that, as long as they've been fairly convicted of that crime. There's a problem that exists at the moment, that there's too much emphasis on rehabilitation and what works for the criminal and not enough on justice for the victims.
Okay, gentlemen, a lot more to discuss on this issue, but I'll have to leave it at that for now. Ajmal Masroor, Charles Shoebridge, and Ben Harris-Quinney, and earlier Kartik Raj. Good to have you all on the program. Thanks so much. And thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.